He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
There are moments in television history that nobody planned for, moments that slipped past the writers, past the directors, past the network executives sitting in their polished boardrooms, and landed directly in the living rooms of millions of Americans without warning. Most of those moments are forgotten within a week. A stumbled line here, a technical glitch there. Television, in its early days, was an imperfect machine, and audiences largely forgave its imperfections. But every so often, a single unscripted beat lands so hard, so differently than anything that came before it, that it changes the entire conversation. Not just about the show it happened on, but about what television is allowed to be, what it is supposed to show, and where the invisible boundary sits between entertainment and something uncomfortably close to the truth. That is what happened with the Honeymooners. And the story of how one moment, one delivery of a line that audiences had heard dozens of times before, quietly unraveled one of the most beloved comedies in American broadcast history, is a story that has never quite been told with the full weight it deserves. Because the network didn't hold a press conference. Jackie Gleason didn't give an interview explaining what went wrong. There was no dramatic cancellation announcement, no farewell episode, no proper goodbye to the characters that had redefined what a sitcom could look like. There was just silence, the kind that follows something that cannot be taken back. To understand that silence, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to 1955, when the Honeymooners officially became its own standalone series on CBS, but further back, to the streets of Brooklyn, where a boy named Jackie Gleason was learning what frustration looked like up close. Jackie Gleason was born in 1916 in Bushwick, Brooklyn, into a household where money was always short and dignity was something you had to fight to hold on to. His father disappeared from the family when Jackie was only 9 years old, leaving his mother to raise him through a combination of exhausting work, sheer willpower, and a love that never fully compensated for the hole that abandonment leaves in a child. That kind of childhood does not make you soft. It makes you observant, quick, and deeply attuned to the particular frustration of a person who wants more than the world seems willing to give them. Gleason grew up among neighbors who shouted their arguments through thin apartment walls, who hatched grand schemes at kitchen tables and watched those schemes collapse by morning, who loved their families fiercely and expressed that love poorly. He absorbed all of it. He carried it inside him the way a musician carries rhythm, not as something he studied, but as something that became part of how he moved through the world. Pool halls and odd jobs filled his early years, along with a restless, driven energy that had no clear destination yet, but was not going to stay still for long. By the time Gleason found his footing in variety entertainment, first in clubs and theaters, and then on television, he had an entire neighborhood inside him waiting to come out. When CBS's Dumont Network gave him Cavalcade of Stars in the early 1950s, Gleason introduced a character who would define his entire legacy. Ralph Cramden, a New York City bus driver with an enormous ego, an even bigger mouth, and a heart that was, beneath all the bluster, genuinely tender. Ralph was not a polished television father. He was not wise or calm or reliable. He was loud, impatient, perpetually convinced that the next scheme would finally be the one that changed everything, and perpetually wrong about that conviction. He was, in other words, deeply human in ways that television characters almost never were in 1951. When the Honeymooners launched as its own series in the fall of 1955, American television was operating under a specific set of unspoken rules. Family life was supposed to look a certain way on screen. Homes were neat and well-furnished. Fathers were sensible and authoritative. Wives were warm, supportive, and largely decorative in terms of narrative function. Problems were introduced at the beginning of an episode and resolved neatly before the credits rolled. Nobody shouted at anyone they loved. Nobody went to bed angry. The suburbs were paradise, and television was the medium that existed to remind you of that paradise every evening. The Honeymooners threw all of that overboard. Ralph and Alice Cramden lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment with peeling walls and minimal furniture. There was no backyard, no car parked in the driveway, no cheerful kitchen full of modern appliances. The table at the center of their apartment was where arguments happened, where dreams were announced and shot down, where two people who genuinely loved each other expressed that love largely through combat. Alice Cramden, as portrayed first by Pert Kelton and then, most memorably, by Audrey Meadows, was not anyone's idea of a passive television wife. She was sharp, quick, and completely unwilling to absorb Ralph's bravado without firing back. She matched him line for line, And when she didn't match him with words, she matched him with a look that said everything words couldn't. The working-class authenticity of the show was both its greatest strength and the source of its most persistent tensions with the network. Audiences responded to it with an enthusiasm that surprised even CBS. These were not the idealized families of primetime television. These were people who looked and sounded like the people watching from their living rooms, people who argued about money, who dreamed too big and fell short, who loved each other imperfectly and kept going anyway. That kind of honesty was rare on television in 1955, and it was electric. But electricity, as anyone who has handled live wires knows, is also dangerous. Before the show ever reached its most controversial moment, it had already been shaped by forces that had nothing to do with comedy. The Red Scare of the late 1940s and 1950s cast a long and unforgiving shadow over the American entertainment industry. The blacklist, that informal but devastatingly effective mechanism by which studios, networks, and advertisers refused employment to anyone suspected of communist sympathies or associations, was not simply a Hollywood phenomenon. It reached into New York television with equal force, and it reached directly into the cast of The Honeymooners. Pert Kelton, the original Alice Cramden on Cavalcade of Stars, was a performer of considerable talent and distinctive energy. Her Alice was combative, sharp-edged, and entirely convincing as the kind of woman who would share a Brooklyn apartment with Ralph Cramden and not be ground down by the experience. Then, without public announcement and without formal explanation, she was gone. The official word was health concerns. The real story, understood clearly by those working on the production, was that her husband had come under scrutiny for alleged communist ties, and in the atmosphere of the early 1950s, that scrutiny was enough. No charges. No evidence. No due process. Just a quiet removal from a role she had created because the network calculated that association was too costly a risk. The replacement of Kelton with Audrey Meadows was itself a minor controversy. CBS executives initially felt Meadows was too glamorous for the role, too polished, too obviously attractive to be convincing as a working-class housewife in a cramped apartment. Meadows, who possessed a competitive intelligence that matched anything Alice Cramden ever displayed on screen, chose not to argue the point. Instead, she arrived at her follow-up audition in photographs that showed her without makeup, in plain, unflattering clothes, with her hair pulled back without styling. She looked, in those photographs, exactly like Alice Cramden. Gleason saw the photos and made the decision immediately. What Meadows brought to the role was something subtly but importantly different from what Kelton had established. Where Kelton's Alice met Ralph's energy with equivalent volume, Meadows played Alice with a quieter, more grounded confidence. She didn't need to match Ralph decibel for decibel because her timing was precise enough that she could wait for his fury to exhaust itself and then deliver a single line that deflated him completely. It gave the show a different internal rhythm, one where Ralph's explosions felt larger because Alice's stillness made them stand out more sharply. The chemistry worked. The show ran. And for one season, everything seemed to be functioning exactly as it should. October 1956. The episode was called The Deciding Vote, and it was on its surface exactly the kind of story that the Honeymooners handled best. Ralph Cramden becomes convinced that his single vote in a local election will be the pivotal factor in determining the outcome, and the resulting comedy of errors builds through misunderstandings and self-inflation until the whole thing collapses in the inevitable humiliation that Ralph's grandiosity always invited. The premise was clever. The setup was familiar. The live studio audience was ready to laugh. For most of the episode, everything proceeded according to the rhythm that had made the show a success. Gleason was sharp, working the room with the ease of a performer who understood exactly how to control the energy of a live audience. Audrey Meadows was precise and grounded, providing the anchor against which Gleason's performance could swing outward without losing its center. Art Carney's Ed Norton was exactly the lovable, well-meaning chaos agent the character had always been. The audience laughed in the right places. The timing held. Then came the moment. During a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered the line that had become one of the show's most famous running gags. Bang. Zoom. Straight to the moon. The audience had heard this line countless times. It was the comedic threat that was never a real threat. The punchline that defined Ralph Cramden's particular brand of impotent fury, all noise and no danger, an explosion that hurt nobody, a storm that blew itself out in seconds. The audience knew the rhythm of it. They waited for the laugh. The laugh did not come. Something in Gleason's delivery had changed. The line came out of him with a flatness, a cold precision that stripped it entirely of its comedic exaggeration. His body language shifted, he moved closer to Meadows, compressed the physical space between them, and his voice dropped into a register that had none of its usual theatrical inflation. It was not the voice of Ralph Cramden performing frustration for an audience. It was something quieter and more unsettling than that. The studio went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next beat, but the involuntary silence of people who have just witnessed something they weren't prepared for and are still processing what it means. Crew members working behind the cameras later described freezing in place. Nobody laughed. Nobody applauded. The moment passed, the episode continued, and on the surface, the broadcast ended without incident. But in living rooms across the country, something had registered that could not be unregistered. Television in the 1950s was not equipped with the vocabulary or the cultural framework to discuss domestic violence openly. The subject existed in American households, of course, as it always has, but it did not exist on television, not as a topic for serious examination, and certainly not as something that could surface, even accidentally, in the middle of a primetime comedy. The Honeymooners had always walked a particular line, the bang, zoom line was always, at some level, a joke about threatened violence that the audience understood was never real. Ralph's bluster was the joke. His powerlessness was the joke. Nobody was actually in danger, and the framing of the show made that abundantly clear. Until, for one unintended moment, it didn't. Letters arrived at CBS. Not the usual volume of fan correspondence, but something different. Letters expressing discomfort, asking questions about what they had seen, using language that suggested the audience had, in that one delivery, seen something in Ralph Cramden that they could not laugh off. Critics who had praised the show's working-class honesty now found themselves using the phrase "too real" in a context that was not a compliment. The distinction between uncomfortable truth and acceptable comedy had been crossed, and the crossing had been visible to everyone watching. Behind the closed doors of CBS, the conversations were urgent and private. The show's ratings, while still respectable, had been showing a gradual softening. Sponsors, the actual financial engine of network television in this era, were already communicating their nervousness about the show's rough edges, a phrase that covered everything from the show's aesthetic rawness to its increasingly unpredictable lead performer. Gleason's lifestyle off-camera, the late nights, the heavy drinking, the general air of a man who operated at maximum intensity in all directions, made him difficult to manage and impossible to fully predict on live television. One significant sponsor made its position clear after the deciding vote. Either the show's more provocative elements were brought under control, or financial support would be withdrawn. In the economics of 1950s broadcasting, that kind of ultimatum was not a negotiating position. It was a conclusion. The decision was made. There would be no press release. There would be no announcement. The show that had run for 39 episodes would simply not return. 1 week it was there, and the next week it was gone, and the millions of viewers who had been watching every Friday night were left without explanation. For Jackie Gleason, the end of the Honeymooners was not simply a professional setback. Ralph Cramden was not a character he had constructed from technique and craft, the way an actor approaches a role that is fundamentally external to who they are. Ralph was built from Gleason's own material, from the Brooklyn streets, from the absent father, from the particular texture of growing up working class in a city that offers dreams in abundance and delivers on them sparingly. To lose the show was to lose the place where that version of himself could exist fully and publicly. Gleason responded with a move that was unusual for the period and reflected both his business intelligence and his emotional investment in the characters. He negotiated to buy back the rights to the Honeymooners from CBS, a decision that gave him ownership of Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton and the freedom to revive them on his own terms. Over the following 2 decades, he did exactly that, bringing the characters back in sketch form on his variety programs, and in the mid-1960s, attempting a fuller revival as part of the Jackie Gleason Show, filmed in Miami rather than New York. The Miami version had everything that the original version had lacked in terms of material comfort, color production, longer run